In broad daylight, in the bustling town square, a young woman is dragged onto an auction platform like a commodity, while the entire town watches in silence, no one daring to speak. The ruthless landowner Silas Brigg has turned fear into power, and no one, not a single person, dares to oppose him. Until a lone knight rides into the square, and everything changes forever. Today's story will keep you glued to the screen until the very end. Like, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed. Now, let's begin. The morning Silas Brigg decided to sell Elena Cross, the sky over Dry Hollow was the color of a bad bruise. Purple at the edges, yellow, and sick at the center, the kind of sky that made cattle restless and kept sensible people indoors. But sensible people didn't live in Dry Hollow anymore. The sensible ones had left 2 years ago, when Brigg's men started showing up at ranch doors after dark with legal documents that nobody in town had the education to challenge, and nobody with the education had the courage to dispute. Elena was 23 years old, and she had her father's eyes, gray-green, the kind that looked almost silver when the light hit them right, and her mother's jaw, which was to say a jaw that didn't know how to stay closed when it should. She'd been told that was a flaw her whole life. Standing on the wooden platform in the center of Dry Hollow's market square, with her wrists bound in front of her and Brigg's foreman, a thick-necked man named Dalt Corey, standing 3 feet to her left with a rifle across his chest, she was starting to think maybe stubbornness wasn't such a flaw after all. It was the only thing keeping her legs from giving out. The square smelled like horse dung and sawdust, and the particular kind of fear that collects in crowds who know something wrong is happening and have decided, collectively, that wrong is simply the weather today, and there's no point arguing with weather. There were 40, maybe 50 people gathered. Ranchers in sun-bleached hats, merchants who'd closed their storefronts to come watch. A few women near the general store who kept glancing at each other like they were waiting for one of them to do something, except none of them knew what that something was. 2 of Brigg's deputies, not lawmen in any honest sense, just men with badges. Brigg had ordered a silversmith in Tucson to stamp out by the dozen, leaned against the water trough with their thumbs hooked in their gun belts, looking bored the way men look bored when they're actually paying very close attention. Silas Brigg himself stood at the edge of the platform, not on it. That was deliberate. He never stood on the platform. Platforms were for things being sold. Brigg was the one doing the selling, and he made sure everyone could see the difference. He was 61 years old, lean as a fence post, with a white mustache he kept trimmed to a precise line above his lip, and eyes the color of old coins, flat and dull, and worth exactly what he decided they were worth. He dressed like a man on his way to a business meeting in a city that didn't exist out here, which was the point. The suit said, "I am not of this dust." The suit said, "I am above what is happening here, even as I cause it to happen." "The debt is documented," Brigg said to no one in particular, because he didn't need to address anyone in particular. The crowd was his audience, not his peers. "Thomas Cross borrowed $1,100 from my land company 3 years ago, secured against the property and all associated assets. Thomas Cross died without settling that debt. His daughter, as sole heir, assumes it. This is the law." Elena's fingers curled into fists inside her rope. "It's not the law," she said, loud enough for the front row to hear. "It's paper you wrote yourself and had your own man notarize. My father never borrowed money from you. He never borrowed money from anyone." Corey took one step closer without looking at her. Not a threat exactly, just a reminder of proximity. $1,100, Brigg continued, plus 2 years of accrued interest and administrative fees amounts to a sum this woman cannot pay. He said woman the way he might say the property in question. The Cross Ranch and its contents have already been absorbed into my holdings. What remains is the personal obligation. He turned slightly, making a small gesture with his hand, almost graceful. "We will proceed." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The women near the general store had stopped looking at each other. Elena looked out at the crowd, and she recognized faces. Pete Dunbar, who'd bought oats from her father for 12 years, and once helped pull a calf out of a ditch in a February storm. Sarah Aiken, whose daughter Elena had taught to read on Wednesday afternoons the year before last. Old Wren Marsh, who'd sat on her porch and drunk her father's coffee and talked about the railroad coming and what it might mean for the valley. She looked at all of them, and not one of them looked back. Not directly. They looked near her, around her, at the ground, at their own boots, at the middle distance where the horizon offered nothing. She understood then, not for the first time, but more completely than before, that understanding the difference between right and wrong doesn't help you much when the people around you have decided that survival is a different category from both. "Opening bid," Corey announced, his voice flat as a board. $500. The silence stretched. Then a man near the back said, $550, and the auction began. She didn't know how long it lasted. Time moved strangely on that platform, stretched thin in some places, collapsed entirely in others. She heard numbers called out, 600, 650, 750, and she focused on keeping her breathing even and her spine straight, because the one thing she was certain of was that she would not let them see her fold. Whatever happened after this, wherever she ended up, she would not give them the image of her on her knees. She recognized some of the voices. Wallace Pruitt, who ran cattle on the North Range. He'd been up to 800 before going quiet. A man she didn't know, with a brocade vest and the look of someone who'd ridden in from somewhere with money and no local complications, had pushed it to 950. 950. For a human being. For her. Elena closed her eyes briefly and thought about her father. Thomas Cross had been a quiet man, steady, the kind of quiet that isn't empty but full of attention, of patience, of a particular careful love for the land he'd worked, and the daughter he'd raised alone after her mother died of a fever when Elena was 4. He had not been a man who borrowed money. He had not been a man who made enemies. He had simply been a man who owned something Silas Brigg wanted, and in Dry Hollow, that was the only sin that mattered. 950, Corey said. Do I hear 1,000? Elena opened her eyes, and that was when she heard the horse. Not the sound of a horse in the street. There were horses everywhere, tied to posts, shifting in their traces. This was different. This was a horse moving with intent, at a pace that wasn't hurrying but somehow communicated that it didn't need to hurry, that hurrying was for people who weren't sure of their arrival. The crowd shifted. She felt it before she saw it, a kind of collective reorientation, like grass bending in a wind that hadn't reached you yet. Heads turned, bodies angled. The 2 deputies at the water trough stopped looking bored. The rider came through the gap between the feed store and the hotel, and everything about him was ordinary until you looked longer, and then nothing about him was ordinary at all. He was maybe 35, maybe older. The sun had done things to his face that made age difficult to guess. Dark-haired, trail-worn, riding a gray horse that moved like it had opinions about where it was going and had decided this was where. He wore a plain canvas duster, road dirty, and a hat that had started life black and become something more complicated since. He had a rifle in the scabbard and a Colt on his hip, and neither of them looked like accessories. He stopped at the edge of the square and looked at the platform. Looked at Elena. Looked at Brigg. Then he looked at the crowd the way a man looks at a problem he's seen before, and is deciding how much patience he has for it today. Elena heard it then. Whispered, passed from mouth to mouth through the gathered crowd the way fire moves through dry brush. Ronan Creed. That's Ronan Creed. She didn't know the name. She would come to understand over the days that followed that not knowing it was its own kind of privilege, because everyone who did know it was carrying some version of the same weight right now. Stories accumulated around Ronan Creed the way silt accumulates around a rock in a river. Layered, not always accurate, but shaped by real force. He'd ridden with a marshal service for 6 years before something happened that people told different ways depending on who was telling it. He'd tracked the Larkin gang across 4 territories and brought back what evidence remained, which wasn't much. He'd stood alone in a box canyon in the Arizona heat against 7 armed men, and 6 of them hadn't walked out. The 7th had, specifically because Creed had let him walk out, because that man was 17 years old, and Creed had made a decision in that canyon that nobody who hadn't been there could fully account for. He was not a man people tried to stop. He was a man people made room for and then talked about afterward, quietly, to explain to themselves why they'd made room. He nudged the gray forward until he was close enough to the platform that Elena could see the color of his eyes. Not that it mattered, but they were a dark, settled brown, like creek water over stone, and they were currently fixed on Silas Brigg with an expression that wasn't anger exactly. It was something quieter than anger and considerably more dangerous. "What's the current bid?" he said. Curry's hand moved toward his rifle without him seeming to decide to do it. "$9.50. You looking to bid, mister? You'll need to state your name for—" "I'm not looking to bid." Ronan's voice was medium in pitch and steady in the way that a wall is steady, not performing steadiness, just being it. He looked at the crowd. "Anyone here bids on her answers to me. That's not a threat. I'm just explaining how the next few hours work." The man with the brocade vest made a sound that might have been the beginning of an objection and then decided it wasn't. Brigg's expression didn't change. That was the most frightening thing about Brigg, Elena had noticed. He didn't react the way people react when they're surprised or offended. He absorbed information the way a spider absorbs the fact of something hitting its web. Patience, assessment, response to come. "And you are?" Brigg said. "Ronan Creed." A pause. Brigg's flat coin eyes moved over the rider with the same dispassionate attention he gave everything. "Mr. Creed," he said, "you are interrupting a legal proceeding." "I've interrupted legal proceedings before. Usually they stop being legal pretty quick once you look at the paperwork." Ronan swung down from the gray without any particular hurry, landed in the dirt, and looped the reins once around the nearest post. He didn't look like a man who'd just ridden hard. He didn't look like a man who was in any kind of a hurry either. "Who notarized the debt document?" Brigg blinked. "Just once? Just slightly." "I beg your pardon?" "The document you're citing as legal basis. I want to know who notarized it. Notary's name, their county of registration, and when their commission was issued." He looked at Corey. "You got that document on you?" Corey looked at Brigg. Brigg said nothing. "Didn't think so," Ronan said. "This doesn't concern you," Brigg said, and something had shifted in his voice, something very small. A fraction of degree in temperature, the kind you only noticed if you were paying attention. "You have no standing in this matter." "No, but she does." Ronan looked at Elena then, directly, and she met his gaze without looking away, because that was the only response that made any sense to her. Something passed between them that wasn't warmth, not yet. It was more like two people recognizing each other as the same type of stubborn. "What's your name?" "Elena Cross." "Elena Cross." He said it like he was filing it somewhere. "Your father owned the land before Brigg took it?" "My father owned it free and clear, no debt, no lien, no mortgage. I have the original deed." "Where?" "Hidden." He nodded once, like that was the correct answer. Then he turned back to the crowd, and when he spoke it was to all of them, the ranchers and the merchants and the women by the general store who'd been waiting for someone to do something without knowing what. "Anybody who completes this auction," he said, "is buying themselves a problem they didn't wake up this morning thinking they'd have. I'm not here to shoot anybody. I'm here to say that what's happening on that platform isn't a sale. It's a theft, and theft tends to compound. You buy stolen property, you inherit the complication of that theft." He paused. "That's all." Wallace Pruitt, up at the north end of the crowd, tugged his hat down and found somewhere else to look. The brocade vest man had already turned his horse and was moving away with the studied casualness of a man who just remembered a pressing engagement. Corey said, "You're making a serious mistake, Creed." "Probably," Ronan agreed pleasantly. "I've made serious mistakes before. Generally works out." Briggs stood very still for a moment, and Elena watched him run the calculation. She could almost see it happening behind those flat eyes, the columns of risk and leverage and response. He had men here. Corey, the two deputies. 3 or 4 others she'd counted in the gaps between buildings since morning. Ronan Creed had himself and a gray horse and a reputation that apparently made grown men rearrange their calendars. "We will not be conducting the sale today," Briggs said finally, smoothly, as if this had been his idea, as if he were simply choosing to reschedule an inconvenient meeting. "There are some matters of documentation that merit review." He buttoned his jacket, which was already buttoned, a composed man's version of a tell. "Mr. Corey, release Miss Cross." Corey moved toward her with a knife and cut the rope. Her wrists ached where it had bitten. She didn't rub them. Briggs' eyes found Ronan Creed one more time, and what was in them wasn't the anger of a man who'd been beaten. It was the patience of a man who was deciding when and how. "Until next time, Mr. Creed," he said. "Looking forward to it," Ronan said. Bishamt. They were out of the square inside 4 minutes. Elena didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was mutual. Some wordless negotiation between two people who both understood that standing around feeling relieved was a quick way to get shot. She was down off the platform before Corey had fully stepped back, and Ronan had the gray's reins in one hand and was moving toward the alley between the hotel and the saddle shop. And she followed him because she had the original deed to her father's land hidden in a flour tin in the boarding house on 2nd Street and nothing else worth staying for. "You have a horse?" he said. "No. They took everything when they came for me this morning." "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Good, because I only have one horse and this is going to be crowded." He looked at her. "Can you keep up?" "I was managing before you arrived," she said, which was not entirely true but true enough in spirit. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, more a muscle twitch than an expression. "Your stuff. How long to get it?" 5 minutes. "You've got 3. She went up the back stair of the boarding house and came down in 2.5 with the flour tin and the dress she'd arrived in 3 days ago stuffed in a canvas sack and the $17 she'd kept sewn into the hem of her traveling coat because she'd been raised by a man who understood that money hidden was money that was yours. She also took, from under the floorboard in the corner of her room, the Colt Navy she'd kept since her father died. Old, but maintained and loaded, because she'd maintained that habit too. Ronan looked at the revolver when she reappeared but didn't comment on it. "That's all of it?" he said. "That's all of it." They rode out the north end of town on a single horse, which was not comfortable and not fast, and absolutely necessary. And Elena held on to the side of the saddle and kept her balance and didn't speak, because she understood instinctively that this man was doing the work of listening to the town behind them, reading it, and conversation would interrupt that. 2 miles out, he said, "We'll need to get you a horse." "I know. There's a settlement about 8 miles east, friend of mine, or used to be, might be able to help." "Used to be?" "People change." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "What's on the deed?" 400 acres, river frontage on the west, surveyed and registered in my father's name 14 years ago in the county seat. No encumbrances, no mortgages. It's clean paper. Brig can manufacture whatever debt document he likes, but clean paper from a registered survey beats it. Not in his county it doesn't, not with his judges. Then we go somewhere his judges aren't. Another silence. The horse moved steadily through scrub and red dirt, and the morning was burning off into the hard, flat heat of midday, and Dry Hollow was shrinking behind them. "You always this straightforward?" he said. "Mostly," she said. "You?" "Depends on the situation." A pause. "You knew none of those men were going to bid once I spoke." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "I hoped. There's a difference." "True," he said. The land opened up ahead of them, wide and brown and indifferent, full of arroyos and dead brush and distance. Elena looked back once, at the distant smudge of Dry Hollow on the flat horizon, at the column of dust that might have been a rider or might have been wind, and then she looked forward. The settlement Ronan had mentioned was called Cutler's Crossing, which was generous because what it actually was 7 buildings around a well, 4 of them occupied. One of them a combination stable and hardware store run by a man named Arnie Foss, who had a walleye, a collie with 3 legs, and a long-standing policy of not asking questions about the people Ronan Creed brought through his door. Arnie looked at Elena the way people look at things that are going to complicate their afternoon and said, "Heard there was some kind of commotion in Dry Hollow this morning." "Word travels fast," Ronan said. "Dalt Corey's got cousins everywhere." Arnie scratched behind the collie's ear. "She's safe to be around?" "She's standing right here," Elena said. "That don't answer my question." "Arnie," Ronan said, "I need a horse. Good legs, sound wind, not a problem animal." Arnie sighed the sigh of a man who has been having these conversations for 20 years and has developed a complicated peace with them. "I've got a roan mare, 4 years old. She's got some opinions about being saddled, but once you're on, she's steady. $40. 25. 35, and I don't remember you came through here. Done. Elena paid for the horse out of her own money, which she hadn't been asked to do and which she did anyway, because she had $17 and the roan was worth 35, and she made up the difference by removing the flour tin from her canvas sack and placing it on Arnie Foss's counter. Inside were three things: the deed, a letter she'd written to herself 3 months ago describing what Briggs' men had done to her neighbor Pete Dunbar's ranch deed, and a small photograph of her father. She took out the photograph and the deed and gave Arnie the tin and the letter. "If someone comes here and I don't," she said, "this goes to the county recorder in either Yuma or Prescott. Not anyone in Dry Hollows County." Arnie looked at the tin, looked at her. "You doing what I think you're doing?" "I'm distributing my risk," she said. Arnie looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. The old man picked up the tin and put it under the counter. 35 for the horse, he said. "And coffee before you go. Both of you look like you need it." The coffee was terrible. They drank it without complaint. But she learned things about Ronan Creed in increments, the way you learn about weather. Not because it tells you directly, but because you start to understand how it moves. He didn't talk much, but when he talked, he was precise. He said, "I don't know," when he didn't know, without filling the space with guesses. He checked his back trail twice an hour without making it look like anything, which meant it was habit. He could read terrain the way some men read newspapers, quickly, casually, extracting more than was obvious. When they stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek bed in the afternoon, he checked the roan's near foreleg without being asked, because he'd noticed a slight hitch in her stride and wanted to know if it was a stone bruise or something that would worsen. It was a stone bruise. He cleared it with a knife tip, and she watched him do it with the professional focus of a man who's spent enough time with horses that their well-being registers as a practical concern rather than a sentimental one. "You knew who I was," she said. Not a question. "I'd heard of your father," he said, still working on the hoof. "Heard Brig had moved on his land. Didn't know about you until I got to Dry Hollow this morning. And you just decided to ride in." He set the hoof down and straightened up and looked at her the way she'd been looking at him, factually, without performance. "I've been watching Briggs' operation for 6 months. He's been pulling this across 4 counties. Debt documents, forged surveys, purchased judges. Your situation this morning was the most public he's been. I wasn't going to let it play out. Because of the investigation. Because," he said, "it was wrong." He said it simply, without any weight of righteousness, which was the only way that sentence could be said without sounding hollow. "The investigation is useful, but it's not why I rode in." Elena was quiet for a moment. The creek made its small sound. The roan drank. "Thank you," she said. "I'm saying that once. I don't plan to keep saying it." "Fair enough," he said. "And I'm not helpless. I want that understood." "Didn't think you were." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a rock and put it back on. "You had a plan before I showed up?" "I had the beginning of a plan. I needed to get the deed out of Dry Hollow and to someone who could do something with it. I was working on the how." "What changed?" She thought about it. "You gave me the possibility of a different how." He nodded once, accepting this. "The deed alone won't be enough. Briggs got money and connections and time. Proving the debt was fraudulent helps you, but it doesn't touch what he's done to everyone else." "I know. Which means we need the other documents." He looked at her. "What other documents?" "Brig didn't build his operation in Dry Hollow from scratch. He moved here from somewhere, which means he had a system before he came here, which means there's a record somewhere of how he operated before. And somewhere," she paused, working through it, "he's keeping his own records. Men like Brig always do. They document everything because they use their documentation as control. He's got a ledger somewhere, or files, something that shows the full scope of what he's doing, because he needs to manage it." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. "That's either very smart or very dangerous thinking." "It can be both," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite the smile from before, but related to it. "Yeah," he said. "It can be both." They made camp that night in the shelter of a canyon wall, far enough from the trail that firelight wouldn't carry, but close enough to the canyon entrance that they'd hear horses on the approach. Ronan built the fire small and competent, the way he did everything, without ceremony or comment. Elena unrolled her blanket and sat with her back against the rock and ate jerked beef and hardtack and thought about her father. Thomas Cross had built his ranch with his own hands, mostly, had sunk his well in the second summer and struck good water 40 feet down. Had planted the cottonwoods along the creek boundary when Elena was 7, telling her that trees you plant for shade aren't for you, they're for the people who come after, and that was fine, that was the point. Had sat on the porch in the evenings reading old newspapers he got in bundles from the mail coach, 3 and 4 weeks behind, reading them anyway because the news still meant something even delayed. He had been murdered, essentially. Not with a gun. With paper and patience and a system of accumulating pressure so gradual that by the time he understood what was happening to him, he'd been worn down to where the pressure could finish the job. He died of a failure of the heart. The doctor in Dry Hollow had said so, and Elena believed that and also believed the doctor was only describing half of the mechanism. She looked at the fire and she thought, I will not spend the rest of my life being the thing that happened to my father's daughter. There was something on the other side of this, some version of herself that existed past whatever was coming, and she was going to reach it. She didn't know exactly how. She was good at practical intelligence, at reading situations, at the particular stubborn creativity that comes from being a woman who'd had to solve problems without being given the obvious tools. She was going to use all of it. Ronan, she said. He was sitting on the opposite side of the fire, tilted back against his saddle, hat pulled low. He didn't open his eyes, but he was awake. She'd noticed he had a way of resting that wasn't sleeping. Yeah. Brig will come after us. Yes. He'll send more than deputies. Yes. How much time do you think we have before they're on us? He was quiet for a moment. He'll want to do it quietly. Coming after me openly causes him problems. I've got enough of a reputation that a straightforward conflict draws attention he doesn't want. He'll find bounty hunters who can operate without obvious connection to him, men who can explain their presence in any county with a story that doesn't trace back. He tilted his hat back slightly. 2 days, maybe 3 before they're organized, then it depends on how good they are at tracking. So we need to be where they don't expect us. That would be ideal. We need to go east, she said. Not south, not west, not further north, east. Briggs' connections run along the railroad corridor north-south. East is where his influence gets thin. He opened his eyes then and looked at her across the fire. How do you know where his connections run? Because I've been watching him for 8 months, she said. Same as you. I just didn't have a horse or a gun reputation, so I had to be quieter about it. He looked at her for a long moment in the firelight. Then he put his hat back down over his eyes. East, he said. We leave at first light. The canyon wall held the day's heat and gave it back slowly through the night, and the horses shifted and breathed, and somewhere far off a coyote said something to the dark that got no answer. Elena lay with the deed against her chest and the colt at her side, and she thought about cottonwood trees planted for shade by people who wouldn't live to sit in it, and she let herself feel the weight of everything that was wrong. And then she set it aside, because feeling it and drowning in it were different things, and she'd always known the difference. She was still awake when the fire died to coals. So was Ronan, she was fairly sure, though neither of them said so. That was all right. There was time for everything else. What mattered now was the morning and the direction and the distance between where they were and where Briggs' reach stopped being absolute. East, first light. She closed her eyes. They rode east into a country that didn't care about them. That was the right word for it. Indifferent. The Badlands east of Dry Hollow were not hostile in any dramatic sense. They didn't rage or threaten. They simply existed in a way that made human presence feel like a footnote, something the land tolerated briefly and would outlast without effort. Red rock formations rose and collapsed across the horizon in shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost like ruins, except nothing had ever been built here worth ruining. The scrub was gray-green and brittle. The sky was enormous and empty and very blue. The heat by mid-morning was the kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates until you realize you've been inside it for hours. Elena rode the roan with the focused economy of someone who'd been on horseback since childhood. Not showy, just effective, adjusting to the animal's movement without thinking about it. Ronan rode slightly ahead and to her left, close enough to talk, far enough that both of them could move independently if something required it. She noticed he positioned himself that way without discussing it, and she noticed also that he kept the higher ground when the terrain allowed it, and that his eyes moved constantly over the landscape with a rhythm that looked casual and wasn't. They didn't talk much in the first hours. There was a shape to silence between people. Some silences are awkward, some are empty. Some are the kind that two people fall into because they're both paying attention to the same thing and words would only interrupt it. This was the last kind. Elena was reading the land for water signs and good shelter angles. Ronan was reading it for everything else. They compared notes at a narrow wash where they stopped to let the horses drink from a trickle of water that came out of a rock crack and disappeared back into sand 6 feet downstream. "We're being followed," Ronan said. She'd thought so too for the last hour. There was dust to the southwest that was too persistent and too directed to be wind. "How many?" "Hard to say at this distance. 3 at least. Maybe 5. He filled his canteen without looking away from the dust column. "They're not pushing hard yet. They're tracking, not chasing. Waiting to see where we go. Waiting to see if we do something predictable." He capped the canteen. "Are we going to do something predictable?" "That depends," she said, "on whether you know this country or just know about it." He looked at her. "What's the difference?" "People who know about a place know the map. People who know a place know where the map is wrong." She'd studied the country east of Dry Hollow for the better part of a year, not from maps, but from talking to people. Old miners, trading post operators, a Yavapai man named Catches Water, who'd moved through these canyons his whole life and had shared, during 2 evenings at her father's table, more practical information about the land's actual behavior than any survey had captured. "There's a canyon system about 6 miles northeast. The main entrance looks impassable. There was a rockfall maybe 10 years ago that closed it off. But there's a second entrance, south-facing, that you can't see from the main trail." "You've been through it?" "No, but I know someone who has and came out the other side." He studied her for a moment. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough to try it, not certain enough to promise it." That seemed to satisfy something in him. "Show me where." Dead. The second entrance to the canyon was exactly where Catches Water had described it. A gap in the rock face that looked, from 20 feet away, like a shadow rather than an opening, narrow enough that they had to take the horses through one at a time, and even then the stirrups scraped stone. On the other side it opened into a long corridor of rock, cool and dim, the walls rising 60 feet on either side. The floor sandy and soft enough that their passage wouldn't raise the kind of dust that could be seen from the ridge. Ronan stood at the entrance for a long moment after they were through, studying the rock, then pulled brush and deadfall across the gap with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done this kind of thing before. It wasn't invisible. Nothing was invisible to a good tracker. But it raised the cost of following them, and sometimes that was enough. They moved through the canyon system for 2 hours, winding north and east, until the corridor opened onto a wide, flat shelf of rock overlooking a valley that was greener than anything they'd passed since morning. A seep, somewhere up the slope, feeding a line of cottonwoods along a draw. The trees small but alive. The grass around them genuine, rather than the dry pretense of it that covered most of the landscape. "Water," Elena said. "Good campsite," Ronan said. He was already looking back the way they'd come. "We'll see if they follow." They didn't, not that afternoon. By the time the light started going red and long across the rock, there was no sign of movement behind them, no dust, no sound that didn't belong to the wind and the occasional distant bird. Either the trackers had lost them at the canyon entrance or had decided the ground wasn't worth the trouble, and either way the result was the same: a night's rest without needing to take turns sleeping. They made camp in the cottonwood draw, and Elena found, in the hollow of a dead tree, a glass bottle left by some earlier traveler. Prospector, maybe, or just someone passing through who'd needed to lighten their load. She used it to collect water from the seep and boiled it over the fire because she wasn't in the habit of trusting water she didn't know, frontier or otherwise. Ronan pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his coat pocket. a hand-drawn map, dense with notations, and spread it on his knee. "Tell me what you know about Briggs' operation," he said. "Not the history, the structure. Who does what?" She sat across the fire and thought about how to organize it. Briggs himself controls the land documents and the financial side. He doesn't get his hands dirty with the enforcement. That's Corey's territory. Dalt Corey runs the men, manages the deputies, decides who gets leaned on and how hard. There's a man called Evers, Prentice Evers, who handles the legal manipulation. He's not a real lawyer, but he's educated enough to produce convincing paperwork, and he knows which judges will accept it without looking too closely. Where's Evers based? He was in Dry Hollow for the past year, but I think he moves. Briggs been operating in at least 3 other counties before he came here, and someone had to set up the same system in each place. Ronan made a mark on his map. And the judges? There are 2 in Dry Hollows County that I know for certain are on his payroll. One retired last fall. I don't know if his replacement is clean or already bought. There's a circuit judge who rides through 4 times a year who I believe is legitimate, but he's only there briefly, and Briggs times his most questionable proceedings to avoid the circuit. You found all this out. How? I asked questions, she said. I listened. I have a good memory. She paused. People don't think a woman is collecting information. They think she's being sociable. He set the map down and looked at her across the fire. You'd have gotten out of there eventually. Probably. Maybe. She was honest about it. The auction moved up the timeline. I'd expected another month before Briggs made a formal move, and I needed that month to get copies of my information to the right people in other counties. He accelerated, and I wasn't ready. What made him accelerate? She'd been thinking about that. I think he knew someone was watching him. Maybe not me specifically, but he'd gotten careful in the last few weeks. Moved faster than his pattern suggested. The auction wasn't in his usual playbook. Public confrontation is messy. It creates witnesses. He's normally more subtle. He was making a statement, Ronan said, showing the town what happens when someone pushes back. Your father's estate was the pushback. You were the lesson. It was bluntly said, and true, and she didn't flinch from it. Yes, which means he's feeling pressure from somewhere, not just from me. Ronan was quiet for a moment. I've been in contact with a federal land officer out of Prescott. Name is Holloway. He's been building a case against Briggs for 8 months. That's why I've been here. I was gathering field evidence to support his investigation. But Holloway's case needs documentation that connects the fraud directly to the land transfers. What I've got is witness accounts and secondhand paper. He needs the originals. Briggs' own records. Yes. The fire cracked and settled. Elena thought about the document she'd put in Arnie Foss's flower tin, and about all the things she'd collected over 8 months that were still in her head rather than on paper, and about the shape of what Ronan had just described. You can't get into his stronghold, she said, not without a reason he'd accept. No. But I might be able to. Ronan's expression went flat, not dismissive, and she'd already learned to read the difference. This was the look he wore when he was taking something seriously enough to resist reacting to it immediately. Explain. Briggs wants the land. He wants it more than he wants to make an example of me. That was secondary, tactical. If I came to him offering a deal, offering to produce the deed and sign whatever he puts in front of me in exchange for being left alone to leave the territory, she stopped. He wouldn't trust it completely, but he'd consider it, and consideration gets me inside. And then? And then I find what Holloway needs. Ronan picked up a stick and turned it in his hands, not using it for anything, just a thing to do while he thought. It was the first restless gesture she'd seen from him. That's a way to get yourself killed. So is riding east indefinitely with bounty hunters behind us and no plan beyond wait for Holloway to build his case. Holloway's case? Holloway's case is going to take another year, and Briggs will have completed what he's doing to Dry Hollow by then, to all 4 counties. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not talking about doing it tomorrow. I'm talking about planning it properly, with the right timing and the right information about who's in that building and where they keep the records. He looked at her for a long time. The fire was low now, mostly coals, doing that thing coals do where they pulse faintly in the dark, like something breathing. "You ever do anything the cautious way?" he said. "My father was cautious," she said. "He was careful and decent, and he followed every rule, and he died in a chair with Briggs paper debt around his neck." She said it without much heat, which was the only way she could say it. "I'm not interested in caution anymore. I'm interested in effective." Ronan was quiet for a beat, then two, then, "Get some sleep. We'll talk about it in the morning." She took that as neither a yes nor a no, which was probably all she was going to get tonight. And that was all right. She laid out her blanket and looked up at the canyon rim where a strip of stars had appeared against the dark, bright, and indifferent as everything else in this country. And she thought about her father's cottonwoods and about what effectiveness actually looked like versus what it felt like from the inside, which were sometimes the same thing and sometimes very different. 3 things happened over the following 2 days that reshaped what they were doing and how. The first was the town of Oran's Pass. It was small, smaller than Cutler's Crossing, barely a name on any map that had reason to include it. But it had a telegraph office, which was what they needed, and a woman behind the counter who looked at them with the particular expression of someone who has already heard something this morning that is currently complicating her afternoon. "You're the ones from Dry Hollow," she said. Ronan placed a message slip on the counter without confirming or denying it. "This needs to go to Prescott. The address is on the slip. It's urgent." The woman, her name was on a board behind her, Dorothea Wills, postmistress, picked up the slip and read it. She had iron gray hair and the precise, unhurried movements of a person who makes decisions carefully and doesn't apologize for the time it takes. "Briggs' men were through here yesterday," she said. "Left notice that there's a standing warrant out of Dry Hollow County for a woman matching." She glanced at Elena. "Well, is there a federal warrant?" Ronan said. "No." "Then the county warrant is only enforceable in Dry Hollow County, which this isn't." Dorothea looked at him over her spectacles. "I know what county this is, Mr. Creed. I've lived in it for 32 years. She set the message slip on her telegraph key. "The message goes for standard rates. I'll need payment in advance." "There's also a second message," Elena said. She put another slip on the counter. "This one goes to the county recorder in Yuma. Also urgent." Dorothea looked at the second slip for a moment, then at Elena, then back at the key. "Standard rates for both." They paid and waited. Dorothea sent both messages with the practiced speed of a woman who'd been doing this for decades, her hand moving on the key with a kind of easy authority. When she was done, she put her hands flat on the counter and said, in a voice that had gone quiet enough that it didn't carry past the 3 of them, "My brother's ranch is north of Dry Hollow. He had his deed disputed last year, lost the case in county court." She didn't look at either of them directly. "Whatever you're working on, don't let it stop with one man's land." "We're not planning to," Elena said. Dorothea nodded once, sharp and small, and went back to her work. The second thing that happened was the ambush at Barrel Creek. They came down out of the high scrub onto a flat crossing, and Ronan pulled his horse up hard, which Elena had learned to read as a signal she didn't question, and she stopped the roan and waited without asking why. He was very still, which was different from his normal stillness, more concentrated, more directed at something specific. "Ahead," he said, barely audible. 3 o'clock, the willow stand." She looked. She didn't see it immediately, and then she did. The flat angle of light on metal, just the edge of it, in the shadows beneath the willow branches. A rifle barrel. Held at a downward angle, which meant whoever was holding it was crouched or seated and had probably been waiting there for a while. "1," she said quietly. "Maybe 2. Do we go around?" "The creek bends south before it crosses the main trail. Going around costs us 3 hours minimum." He was still watching the willows. "Or we call it." "Call it?" "Make them show themselves before they decide we've walked into their range." She thought about that for half a second. "All right." Ronan raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting, the practiced carrying tone of a man who'd learned to make himself heard outdoors across distances. "You in the willows. I've got you at 20 yards, and you've only got me at 40. You can do the math." Silence. The creek moved. A frog somewhere made a short sound and stopped. Then a voice came out of the willows, ragged and young and frightened in a way that didn't sound professional. We're not here for you. We thought you were Corey's men. Ronan's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. Still watchful, but the quality of the watchfulness changed. Come out, slow. Hands where I can see them. There were two of them. Boys, really. One maybe 18, one younger. The older one had a rifle that was too big for him, and the desperate face of someone who's been scared for a long time and has forgotten what being calm felt like. The younger one was holding a hat in both hands, which was as helpless a gesture as it's possible to make, and his left arm was wrapped in a shirt-strip bandage that had soaked through with blood a few hours ago and dried since. "Where are you out of?" Elena said. "Sutter's Flat," the older one said. "Briggs' men came through 4 days ago. Took the ranch. Our father—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "Our father tried to argue the document, and Corey hit him with a rifle stock." He looked at his brother's arm. "Jared tried to stop them." Elena looked at Ronan. He gave her nothing back. Not encouragement or discouragement, just presence, which she'd come to understand was his version of your call. "Your father," she said, "is he? He's alive. Neighbors got him. He can't travel." The boy's jaw worked. "We were heading east. Heard there might be some kind of marshal service 2 territories over that's been looking into Brig, but we don't know where, and we don't know who." "Halloway," Ronan said. Both boys looked at him. "His name is Halloway. Federal land officer out of Prescott. He's legitimate, and he wants exactly what you have, the witness accounts and documentation of what Briggs' men have done." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, the same map he'd had out by the fire, and tore a section from the margin, which was blank. He wrote on it briefly with a pencil stub and handed it to the older boy. "That's how to reach him and what to say when you do. Tell him you spoke to Creed." The boy looked at the paper like it might be a trap, and then like it might not be. "What do you want for it?" "Nothing," Ronan said. "Get your brother's arm looked at before you go anywhere. The wound's 2 days old, and it's going to go bad if you don't." Elena dismounted and came to Jared's arm without asking permission, because there wasn't time for the social architecture of asking permission, and unwrapped it enough to see. It was a gash, not deep enough to be fatal if cleaned, already deep enough in the process of going wrong that it was going to be a problem in another day. She had a small medical kit in her saddlebag, basics, nothing more. And she cleaned the wound with the whiskey she'd bought in Oran's Pass for exactly this possibility, and the boy made a sound and clenched his teeth and didn't flinch more than that, and she rewrapped it tight with her last clean cloth. "Don't ride on it if you can avoid it," she said. "Find a doctor in the next settlement. We can't pay. Bring the account of what happened to your ranch. Write it down if you can. What happened, when it happened, who was there. That kind of paper has value to the right people." She stood back up. "Don't lose the address." They rode on, and she didn't look back, because looking back would only make it heavier, and there was already plenty of weight to carry. Ronan said nothing for a while. Then, "That was good." "It was basic medicine," she said. "Not that. The record. Telling him to write it down." He was quiet for a beat. "Most people in that situation are thinking about running, not documentation." "Running doesn't fix anything," she said. "It just changes your location." The third thing that happened was the blizzard. She wouldn't have called it a blizzard in most places, but up in the high pass they crossed on the second afternoon, what came down out of the north in the space of 40 minutes was enough to close visibility to 10 feet and turn the trail into a study in how many ways a horse can lose its footing. Ronan knew a passage through, or said he did, and she'd started to trust his sense of terrain enough to follow without arguing. A narrow descent along a frozen rock face that required both of them on foot, leading the horses, moving by feel as much as sight. The roan didn't like it. The mare had opinions, as Arnie Foss had promised, and her opinion of ice-covered rock in a whiteout was nuanced and negative and expressed in short stops and sideways moves that had to be managed rather than forced. Elena talked to her through the worst of it, not calming nonsense, but actual information. This is the next step. The rock here is firmer, 2 more feet. And she didn't know if the mare understood any of it, but the talking seemed to help them both. They came through the other side into a shallow valley where the snow was lighter, and they found an abandoned mining shack at the edge of a stand of pines that had a roof and two walls and the remnants of a stove. And they got the horses inside where it was out of the wind and built a fire in the stove from wood, stacked by whoever had last been here, and sat in the dim, cold interior while the storm raged outside with an impersonal thoroughness that had nothing to do with them. They were both wet and both tired, and both considerably closer to hypothermia than was comfortable. Elena stripped her coat and hung it near the stove and noticed Ronan doing the same, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. They were both just managing the logistics of warmth with the focused pragmatism of people who've gotten past the stage of performing any particular attitude about their situation. "You're not going to tell me that was close," she said finally. "It was close," he said. He was wringing water from his hat. "You did well with the mare. She's a good animal. She just needed to know someone was paying attention." "Most things are like that," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his hat, working a dent out of the brim with his thumbs. And she didn't know if he'd meant that as anything beyond its literal content, but she noted it anyway. "Tell me about the 6 months you were watching Brig," she said. Not because she needed the distraction, but because she'd been wanting to ask and the weather had given them nowhere to go. He thought about how to start. "I came in from the south. Took work on a ranch about 12 miles from Dry Hollow. Legitimate work, branding and fencing. The kind of thing where nobody asks too many questions about where you came from if you're useful. Watched how Brig operated, who reported to him, who he reported to." He paused. "He's got backing from somewhere. His money didn't come from land fraud in 4 counties. There's more behind it." "What kind of backing?" "Railroad, maybe, or the kind of people who want this territory to go a certain way when it gets organized as a proper state." He set the hat on his knee. "Men like Brig don't build this kind of operation out of personal greed alone. They're instruments. Someone benefits from a territory full of displaced families and consolidated land ownership." Elena had thought about this too. If it's railroad backing, there will be a financial record somewhere. Investments, land purchase agreements, something. "Which brings us back to what you suggested last night," he said, looking at her directly. "Getting inside." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say no last night. I said we'd talk in the morning. We didn't get to talk in the morning because of the ambush and the pass. We're talking now." "We're talking now." He leaned back against the shack wall. Outside, the storm hammered the roof with a kind of sustained indifference. "If you went to Brig with an offer, what would you actually do once you were inside, practically, step by step?" She'd been working it out since she'd suggested it. She talked him through it. The approach, the leverage she'd use, the cover story, the specific kind of documentation she'd be looking for, and why Brig would keep it in a particular type of location, the exit strategy if things went wrong. She was precise about it, not because she was trying to impress him, but because precision was the only honest way to present a plan this dangerous. Every gap in the plan was a gap she named aloud. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. The stove ticked. One of the horses shifted. "There's a part of it I don't like," he said. "Which part?" "The part where you're inside and I'm outside. I know. If something goes wrong, I have the Colt, and I have a better than average understanding of how Brig thinks, and I have the deed as a bargaining chip that makes me more valuable alive than dead." She looked at him steadily. "I know the risk. I'm choosing it." He looked at her for a long time with that creek water gaze that she was starting to understand wasn't flat at all. It was a particular kind of serious, the kind that doesn't perform itself, that just sits in a face and means what it means. "You're not going to let me talk you out of it," he said. "No? Or come up with a different plan?" "Not unless your plan is faster and equally likely to work." He almost said something, then didn't. Then, "We'll need 3 or 4 more days to set it up properly. I want to know how many men are in that building before you walk through the door." "Agreed. And I want a signal, something I can see from outside that tells me you're in trouble." "What kind of signal?" He thought about it. "Can you get to a window?" "Probably." "Lamp. 3 flashes, pause, 1 flash. Anything else or nothing means you're all right." "And if I give you the signal?" "Then I come in," he said simply. She looked at him, at the matter-of-fact way he said it, as if coming alone into a building full of armed men was simply the next logical step in the plan. "That's not a rescue," she said. "That's a different kind of problem." "Yeah," he said, "but it'd be our problem instead of just yours." He picked up his hat again. "Get some sleep. Storm should break by morning." She lay back and listened to the storm work itself out against the roof, and she thought about all the people she'd met in 2 days, Dorothea Wills and her brother's disputed ranch, 2 frightened boys at a creek crossing, Arnie Foss and his 3-legged collie, and about the shape of what Brig had built and how many lives were caught inside it, and about how the plan she'd described was dangerous in ways she hadn't named aloud because naming them would only have made the conversation harder without making the plan safer. She thought about Ronan saying our problem instead of just yours, and about how strange it was to have that word applied to her situation after 8 months of carrying it alone. She didn't sleep right away, but eventually, with the stove ticking and the storm running itself into exhaustion outside, and the sound of the horses breathing in the close dark of the shack, she did. The storm broke before dawn, as Ronan had said it would, and left behind it a world that looked scrubbed clean and wasn't. They spent 2 more days working the perimeter of Brig's operation before Elena walked through his front door. 2 days of careful, unhurried reconnaissance, the kind that looks like nothing from a distance because it's designed to. Ronan knew a man in a settlement called Teller's Ridge, 8 miles north of Dry Hollow, who'd done hauling work for Brig's ranch before understanding what kind of operation he was servicing and quietly finding other employment. His name was Cal Demuth, a wide, deliberate man in his 50s who spoke the way he moved, slowly, with no wasted effort, and who sat across a plank table from them in his barn and answered questions with the careful honesty of someone who'd been holding information for a long time and had concluded that holding it wasn't helping anybody. The Brig property, locally called the Brig Compound, though not in earshot of anyone connected to him, was a main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn, a separate building that Demuth called the office house, and a water tower that doubled as a lookout post. The main house was where Brig lived and received visitors. The office house was where Prentice Evers worked, where the legal documents were produced and stored, and where Brig met with anyone who required discretion. The bunkhouses held between 12 and 20 armed men depending on what was happening in the county that week. "The cattle auction," Ronan said. "When is it?" "Saturday," Demuth said. "Annual thing. Brig hosts it, which means half the ranchers in 3 counties come through the gate and nobody thinks twice about extra horses in the yard." He looked at Elena. "You're thinking of going in during the auction." "The auction creates cover," she said. "Legitimate traffic, people coming and going, enough noise and activity that one more face isn't remarkable." "It also means more of his men on the property," Demuth said. "Yes, but most of them will be managing the auction, not watching the office house. The office house won't be where the transaction is. Brig conducts business from the main house when he has company." Demuth looked at her and then at Ronan. "She always think this fast?" "Apparently," Ronan said. Demuth gave her a description of the office house interior that was detailed enough to be useful and honest about its gaps. He'd been in it twice, both times briefly, and he remembered the layout of the front room but not what was behind the door to the back. That was where the records would be, Elena had decided. Brig was methodical. A methodical man kept his most important papers behind the most barriers. "One more thing," she said. "How does Brig conduct himself when he thinks he has the advantage in a negotiation?" Demuth considered it. "He gets patient. More patient than usual. He already thinks slow. The man doesn't hurry for anything. But when he thinks he's winning, he slows down even more. Likes to let you feel the weight of it." "Good," she said. "That's useful." On the ride back from Teller's Ridge, Ronan was quiet in the specific way that meant he was running scenarios. Elena let him run them. She was running her own. "He'll have someone in the room," Ronan said finally. "When you meet with him, he won't see you alone." "Curry, probably. Curry, or someone like him. Someone whose presence is meant to remind you of the shape of your options." "I know, I've thought about Corey." She had. Dalt Corey was a problem with a specific profile. Not subtle, not creative, but attentive and fast, and the kind of loyal that comes from a complete absence of other prospects. He would watch her with the professional suspicion of a man who'd been hired to watch people and had learned to trust his instincts about when something was wrong. She would have to be very good. "I need you to tell me something honestly," she said. "I'll try." "Do you think this works?" He took his time with it. Not the way people take time when they're looking for a gentle way to say no. He actually thought about it, factually, running the variables. "I think there's a 40% chance you get what we need and get out clean," he said. "I think there's a 30% chance something goes wrong but recoverable wrong. And I think there's a 30% chance it goes genuinely bad." 30% isn't small. No, it isn't. "But 60% on the other side isn't small either," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." She nodded. That was the whole conversation, essentially. She appreciated that he hadn't tried to improve the odds by lying about them. She went in alone on Saturday morning, 2 hours after the auction began. She'd borrowed a dress from Demuth's daughter, a woman roughly her size, who'd looked at Elena with the expression of someone who understood what was being asked and why without needing it explained, and who'd pressed the dress into her hands with a look that carried more than words would have. The dress was blue-gray, respectable without being fine, the kind of thing a woman might wear when she had business to conduct. Elena had pinned her hair up and looked at herself in Demuth's small mirror and seen someone who looked composed and didn't feel it, which was exactly right. Feeling composed was for after. The Colt was under her coat, at her back. The deed was folded in the inner breast pocket. She had also, in the opposite pocket, a document she and Ronan had prepared over 2 evenings at Demuth's table. A carefully worded letter that outlined terms of settlement, formally enough to be plausible as a legal document to someone reading it quickly, vague enough in its specifics to give her room to negotiate. She didn't plan to actually negotiate. She planned to use the negotiation as the length of time she needed. Ronan was outside. He'd positioned himself in the tree line to the northwest of the compound with a sight line to the office house windows. They'd agreed on a fallback. If she wasn't out by 2 hours, he would move to the east fence. 3 flashes, pause, 1. That was all she needed to give him. She rode through the gate behind a group of ranchers who were talking cattle prices and didn't look at her twice. The compound was loud with the auction's activity. Men calling figures, cattle moving through the far pen. The general organized confusion of commerce conducted at volume. She moved through it with the focused calm of someone who has a specific destination and knows where it is, which is the best possible disguise because it looks exactly like belonging. A man at the main house door stopped her, young, hard-faced, the kind of alertness that came from being paid to have it. "What's your business?" "I need to speak with Mr. Brigg," she said. "Tell him it's Elena Cross. Tell him I've come about the deed." The young man looked at her for a moment, then went inside. She stood on the step and listened to the auction sounds and kept her breathing even and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed over the past 8 months when doing otherwise would have made her useless. He came back in 3 minutes. "Mr. Brigg will see you." Silas Brigg's receiving room was what she'd expected from a man who thought of himself as occupying a different category from the frontier around him. Heavy furniture, an actual rug, a painting on the wall that depicted a European landscape that had no relationship to the red rock and scrub visible through the window behind it. He was standing when she came in, which she noted as deliberate, because standing controlled the room in a way sitting did not. Dalt Curry was by the window. She'd expected that too. "Miss Cross," Briggs said. Not surprised, not warm, not anything in particular, just receiving information. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is," she said. She took the chair across from his desk without being invited, because sitting when he was standing made her smaller in his perception, and she wasn't interested in that. "I'll be direct. I've thought about my situation carefully, and I've concluded that I'm not in a position to win the kind of fight you'd bring against me. I have one asset, the deed, and I'd like to see if there's a transaction that works for both of us." Brigg moved to his chair, settled into it with the deliberate ease of a man who has a great deal of time. "Sit down, Dalt," he said, without looking at Corey, and Corey moved to a chair near the wall. "Go on, Miss Cross." The deed establishes clean title to the Cross property. No encumbrances, registered 14 years ago. Whatever debt document you've produced doesn't stand against original registered survey documentation in any court outside your county. She let that settle without pushing it. I want safe passage out of this territory. I want written assurance that no further legal action will be taken against me. In exchange, I'll sign whatever conveyance document you need for the land, and I'll make no further dispute. Brigg looked at her for a long moment. He had a glass of water on his desk. Not whiskey, she noted. Not during the auction. The man was disciplined about his work. And he touched its base with one finger, not drinking, just touching. You rode back here, he said, through territory my men have been covering for a week, to offer me a settlement. Yes. Why now? Why not a week ago before this became complicated? Because a week ago I thought I had better options, she said. I don't. And Ronan Creed is not my partner in anything. He intervened because that's apparently what he does. I haven't seen him since the second day. Brigg absorbed this. He was doing the thing Demuth had described, slowing down, feeling the weight of his advantage, taking his time because he could. The deed, he said. You have it with you? I have a copy, she said, which was true. She'd made a copy at Demuth's, with Demuth witnessing it. The original is with a party outside this territory. It reaches the county recorder in Yuma automatically if I don't collect it within the week. Something moved in Brigg's eyes. Very small, very controlled. That's a significant claim. It's a true one. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, I'll need to review any settlement terms with Evers before I can commit to anything. My land lawyer. He's in the office house. He stood. If you'll wait here, I'll have him come over. She had been counting on this. It had in fact structured the conversation to produce exactly this result. If Brigg went to the office house himself, she lost her window. If Evers came here, the office house would be briefly less attended than usual, because Evers was the kind of man who worked alone and kept his own door. Of course, she said. Brigg left. Corey stayed. She sat quietly and looked at the painting of the European landscape and thought about what was happening and what was going to happen, and she measured her heartbeat, which was elevated, against what it needed to be for the next part of this to work, and found the gap between them was manageable. You're braver than I'd have given you credit for, Corey said from his chair. She looked at him. Is that a compliment? Just an observation. He had his arms folded, not aggressive. He'd relaxed slightly, which meant Brigg had relaxed, and Corey followed Brigg's temperature like a compass needle. Walking back in here, most people in your position would have kept running. Running indefinitely didn't appeal to me. No? He studied her. What's the play, really? Because what you've described is a bad deal for you. It's a survivable deal for me, she said. Those aren't the same thing, but sometimes survivable is what you're working with. Corey looked at her for a moment, and something in his face shifted. Not softening, exactly, but complicating. He was not a stupid man. That was the problem with Corey. He was not stupid, just committed to the wrong thing with too much investment to reconsider. Brigg's not going to let you just walk away, he said, quietly enough that it wasn't meant to carry. I know, she said, equally quietly. Then what are you actually doing here? She met his eyes. Waiting for something. He sat with that for a moment. Then he seemed to decide that she was either crazy or smarter than he could fully account for, and in either case she was contained in a room with him, and that was sufficient. He looked back out the window. 6 minutes later she heard it, the sound she'd been measuring her patience against since she walked through the door. Not a shot. Not any kind of violence. Just a sudden change in the quality of the noise coming from the direction of the auction pen. A collective shift in register that meant something unexpected had entered the proceedings. Ronan's voice, carrying the way it carried, not shouting, just projecting, audible through the wall of the main house with the clarity of a man who knew how to make himself heard. My name is Ronan Creed, and I'm calling Silas Brigg to answer for what he's done in this territory. Anyone in this yard who wants to know the truth of how their neighbor's land ended up in Brigg's name, stay where you are, Gaunt. Corey was on his feet before the sentence finished. He looked at Elena, and she looked at him, and the calculation in his face moved through several stages very quickly. You knew, he said. I did, she said. He moved for the door. She let him go, because Corey going to the yard was what she needed. She was on her feet before his boots hit the porch step, moving to Briggs' desk. She didn't have time to find everything. She knew this going in, had accepted it. She had time for one thing, the most important one, and she was going to find it because she knew what she was looking for. Prentice Evers was meticulous, and meticulous men organized their most important documents by date and category, and the category she needed was land transfers in the years before Dry Hollow, the evidence of a pattern that predated this county and would therefore demonstrate to any honest court or federal officer that Briggs' operation was systematic and deliberate rather than a series of local disputes. The desk had 6 drawers. She went through them with controlled speed. 3 held current correspondence, auction records, household accounts. The 4th was locked. She looked at the locked drawer and looked at her time. Through the window, she could see the auction crowd, reoriented, the way a crowd reorients when something more interesting than cattle prices is happening. She could see Ronan on his horse at the edge of the pen, and she could see Brigg emerging from the direction of the office house, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who does not run because running concedes something. And she could see Corey crossing the yard toward them both. She took the letter opener from the desk surface, silver, heavy, with a flat, narrow blade, and put it into the gap above the locked drawer with the specific leverage angle her father had once shown her when a trunk lock had jammed on a camping trip when she was 12, pressing down and sideways simultaneously. The drawer was old enough and the lock simple enough, and she was determined enough, and it gave with a crack that was too loud in the quiet room, and she froze for half a second and then opened the drawer. Inside, a leather portfolio tied shut with a cord. She pulled it, opened it. Letters. Personal correspondence between Brigg and a man whose name she recognized immediately because Ronan had mentioned it, the financial backer. The letters were dated across 4 years, across 3 territories, and they described, in the careful euphemistic language of men conducting illegal business on paper, an organized scheme of land acquisition through manufactured debt, forged documentation, and judicial bribery. She couldn't take the originals. If she took the originals and was caught, they vanished. She had to work faster and smarter. She spread 3 letters on the desk surface and pulled from her inner pocket the folded settlement letter she'd brought as cover, turned it over to the blank side, and began writing. Not transcribing, summarizing. Dates, names, specific figures, specific language that would allow a federal officer to subpoena the originals. She wrote fast and small, and her handwriting, which was good, got worse as her hand moved faster than was comfortable, and she didn't care because legibility was the minimum standard, not elegance. Outside, Ronan's voice continued. She could hear it in fragments through the window. Forged survey documents, I have copies from 3 counties. The debt against Thomas Cross was manufactured. The notary's commission expired 18 months before the document was signed. She heard Briggs' voice then, controlled and cold, cutting across the crowd. This man is a trespasser and a fugitive. Someone remove him. Anyone who moves on me moves on a federal investigation, she wrote faster. The last letter she summarized had a figure in it, a specific sum transferred between a named account and Briggs Land Company. That was by itself enough to trigger federal review. She wrote it twice to make sure she had it right, then folded her paper, replaced the portfolio, pushed the drawer shut, and looked at the room. She'd been in it 11 minutes. She put the letter opener back on the desk, facing the same direction it had been. She did not look like someone who'd just broken a lock and copied criminal evidence. She sat back in her chair and crossed her hands in her lap and arranged her face into the expression of a woman who has been waiting with reasonable patience for a legal consultation that is taking longer than expected. The window. She needed the window. Not for the signal, because the signal was for emergency, and this was not yet emergency. This was controlled chaos, which was different, but for what she could see from it. What she saw was this. Ronan had ridden to the center of the auction pen, and the crowd of ranchers and merchants who'd come for the auction had formed a rough semicircle around him. Not aggressive, but not dismissing him either. The posture of people who are hearing something they already half knew and are deciding what to do with hearing it confirmed. Brigg was at the edge of the pen, and his expression from 40 feet away was the same expression she'd seen at the auction in Dry Hollow's Market Square. That flat, assessing patience. Except now there was something beneath it. something he was managing rather than feeling. Corey was at his shoulder. 4 or 5 armed men had positioned themselves around the pen's perimeter, but they were looking at Brigg for direction, and Brigg hadn't given it yet. Then Brigg said, loud enough to carry, "Mr. Creed, I'm going to offer you one opportunity to remove yourself from my property before I have you physically removed." "That's generous," Ronan said. He was still on the gray, still unhurried. He looked like a man at the edge of a campfire, not the center of a confrontation. "I'd rather you answer a question first." "I don't answer to you." "No, but you might answer to them." Ronan looked at the crowd, at the ranchers who'd come to do business, who knew each other's names and each other's land and each other's years of work. "How many of you have had a land dispute with Brigg's company in the last 3 years? Don't raise your hand. Just think about it. Think about how it started. Think about who brought the paperwork." The silence in the pen had a specific texture, not empty, but full of people doing exactly what Ronan had said. "I have documentation from Prentice Evers' own hand," Ronan said, "that the debt instruments used in at least 6 of those disputes were produced in this office house, not in any county courthouse, and notarized with a commission that didn't exist at the time of signing." He reached into his coat and produced papers, the copies Demuth had helped them organize, witness statements, the message from Halloway that confirmed federal interest. "These go to a federal land officer in Prescott by the end of the week regardless of what happens today. I'm not here to make a legal argument. I'm here because these men came for cattle prices today and they deserve to know what's been running alongside the cattle business in this territory." Brigg turned to his nearest armed man, a thick, competent-looking enforcer Elena didn't know by name. He said something quiet. The man moved. Elena saw it from the window, saw the movement, saw where it was going, and made her decision in the half-second she had before the window became irrelevant. She didn't give the signal. She walked out the front door of the main house and into the yard and across it at the fastest walk that wasn't running. Running was panic, walking was purpose. And she came through the gate to the auction pen and she said, loudly, in a voice she pulled from somewhere below the fear, "I have it." Every head turned. She had the folded paper in her hand, her summary of Brigg's correspondence, her handwritten record of the figures and names and dates. She held it up not like a weapon, but like a fact. Financial records connecting Brigg's operation to outside backing, across 4 years and 3 territories. Names, figures, dates. I've copied them. She looked directly at Brigg. "The originals are still in your desk. I left them there for the federal officer to retrieve with a proper warrant." She looked at the crowd. "I'm Elena Cross. Silas Brigg tried to sell me in a public square in Dry Hollow 1 week ago to satisfy a debt my father never owed. This," she raised the paper slightly, "is what he was protecting when he did it." The enforcer who'd been moving had stopped. He was looking at Brigg. Brigg was looking at Elena with an expression that had, finally, after a week of that flat coin patience, come to the end of what it could absorb without changing. "That document is stolen property," Brigg said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was more frightening than loud would have been. "You broke into my private—" "It's a summary I wrote of documents in your possession," Elena said, "in my own handwriting, on paper I brought with me. Nothing left your building." She kept her voice even. "Which you're welcome to verify." The rancher nearest her, a man she didn't know, gray-haired, with a face weathered to the texture of old wood, said, "What names?" She looked at him. "The financial backer's name is in there, the account the money moved through. If you've done business with any institution connected to that name, you'll recognize it." "Who is it?" another man said. "Read it for yourself," she said, and handed the paper to the gray-haired man because handing it to one person made it a shared thing, not just her word. The gray-haired man read it. His face didn't change much, but his jaw tightened on the right side, a small, involuntary movement that told her the name meant something to him. He passed it to the man next to him without being asked. Brigg said, very precisely, "Corey." And Ronan said, "Don't." Not loud, not a threat in tone, just the word, delivered with the weight of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment and has been very clear with himself about what he will do if it arrives. Corey looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Corey. The gray horse stood very still. The paper was moving through the crowd now, hand to hand, and the reading faces were doing what faces do when they receive information that rearranges something they thought they understood, shifting, tightening, going inward for a moment, and then coming back out, changed. Brig made his decision then. Elena saw it happen, saw the precise moment he concluded that the crowd had tipped past the point where force would do anything but confirm everything being said about him. He had always been a man who understood leverage, and the leverage here had moved. What his armed men could accomplish right now was not suppression, but acceleration. It would turn a bad public moment into the kind of incident that brought federal attention before he'd had time to manage his exit. He straightened his jacket, that same gesture from the market square, the composed man's tell, and said to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "This matter will be addressed through proper legal channels." "It will," Ronan said. Starting with Holloway's office in Prescott. Brig turned and walked back toward the main house. Corey went with him. Two of the armed men started to follow and then seemed to calculate their own position in the situation, and didn't. Elena stood in the auction pen with the crowd of ranchers around her, the paper still passing hand to hand, the afternoon light going long across the compound, and she felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite triumph. It was something more complicated, more tired, the feeling of having spent a great deal of precision and attention and having it land roughly where you aimed it, without any of the grace that makes it look easy in retrospect. Ronan rode to her, looked down at her from the gray. "You walked out early," he said. "Things moved faster than expected." "Did you get what we needed?" "Enough," she said. "Enough to give Holloway something to pull on." She looked up at him. "He's not finished. He'll run. He'll try to reach whoever's backing him and manage the story before Holloway can act." "I know." "We can't let him get out of the territory." "I know," Ronan said again. He looked toward the main house where Brig had gone. Then he looked back at her. "Can you ride?" She thought about the past week. She thought about a canyon entrance that looked like a shadow, and two frightened boys at a creek crossing, and a mining shack in a blizzard, and a locked drawer that gave with a crack too loud in a quiet room. "Yes," she said. He reached down. She took his hand and put her foot in the vacated stirrup and swung up behind him. They rode out of the auction pen and into the long afternoon, and the crowd watched them go, and the paper with the names and the figures was still moving through those weathered hands, and behind them in the compound, Silas Brig was discovering the precise dimensions of a problem that had, over the course of one afternoon, become significantly larger than he'd allowed himself to believe it could be. Brig ran south. They knew it within the hour when Cal DeMuth's youngest boy, 16, fast on a borrowed horse, came up the trail from Teller's Ridge with the news that a small party had left the compound's back gate 20 minutes after Elena and Ronan rode out the front. 3 horses. Brig, Corey, and one other man nobody recognized. They'd taken the south road, which cut toward the territory line through a series of dry washes that were difficult to follow and easy to disappear in if you knew them. "He's not heading for the territory line," Ronan said. He was looking at the map again. The same hand-drawn map he'd had since the beginning, now dense with additional notations from the past week. "The south road splits at Craner's Junction. Territory line is west. East goes to Alderton." "Alderton has a railroad depot," Elena said, "and a telegraph office he hasn't compromised." He looked at her. "He's going to reach his backer before we can. Get his story in first, start managing the damage." "Can he?" "Depends on how fast we move." He folded the map. "And whether Holloway's already in motion." The telegram she'd sent from Dorothea Wills's office in Oran's Pass had gone out 4 days ago. Holloway was in Prescott, which was 2 days' hard ride from this territory. But Holloway had been building this case for 8 months, and a man who'd been building a case for 8 months didn't need to be present to set its pieces moving. He had contacts, deputy officers, the machinery of a federal investigation that could be activated by the right message. What Elena didn't know, couldn't know, was what that machinery had done in 4 days and what it would do in the next 24 hours. She thought about the paper she'd handed to the gray-haired rancher in the auction pen, moving through those weathered hands. She thought about the 2 boys at Barrel Creek and the address Ronan had given them. She thought about Dorothea Wills saying my brother's ranch is north of Dry Hollow, in a voice that carried 32 years of watching and waiting for someone to do something. "There's something else we can do," she said. Ronan looked at her. Briggs aren't men. The ones who stayed at the compound after he left, they're not loyal to him. They're paid. And whatever he was paying them, he's not in a position to pay it now. She worked through it. If someone goes back to that compound tonight with the right message, most of those men are going to conclude that this particular employment has become unprofitable. Who goes back? She looked at Demuth's boy, who had been sitting quietly on his horse during this conversation with the alert stillness of someone trying very hard to look like he wasn't listening. How many people in Teller's Ridge know what happened at the auction today? The boy blinked. All of them by now, I'd reckon. My pa sent word soon as you left. And how many of them have had business with Brig they weren't happy about? The boy's expression went dry in a way that was older than 16. Most of them. Go home, she told him. Tell your father we need anyone willing to ride to the compound tonight. Not to fight, to talk. Specifically, to talk to the men in those bunkhouses about the fact that there's a federal investigation open on their employer and that cooperating with it is considerably better for their futures than the alternative. The boy looked at Ronan, who gave him nothing either way, then back at Elena. You think they'll listen? I think men who hire out their guns do a constant private calculation about risk and reward, she said. Right now, Briggs' risk column just got a lot heavier. Yes, they'll listen. The boy turned his horse and rode. Ronan watched him go. You're not coming with me after Brig, he said. It wasn't a question. No. Someone needs to stay and make sure the compound doesn't reorganize itself under Corey's second when Corey realizes Brig is run and decides to establish his own version of what happened today. She looked at him steadily. Also, the prisoners. What prisoners? Demuth mentioned it, first night at his table. Brig had a holding area. He called it a storage cellar, where he kept people who were too difficult to release and too complicated to deal with publicly. Demuth didn't know who was in it currently or how many. We do know it exists. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Elena, I know what I'm doing. You know what you're planning. That's not the same. It's what we have, she said. You need to catch Brig before he reaches that telegraph office. I need to be here to make sure what we started today doesn't collapse the moment you ride south. She met his eyes. You can't do both. I can do one. So we each do the one we can. He looked at her with that settled, serious gaze she'd come to read as his version of respect. Not warm, not sentimental, just real, the look of a man acknowledging something factual. If Corey comes back, I have the Colt, and I have Cal Demuth, and I have a yard full of ranchers who just read documentation that tells them they've been stolen from. She paused. I'll be fine. He might have said something else. He didn't. He turned the gray and rode south into the long orange light of the afternoon, and Elena watched him go with the particular feeling of someone who has just made a decision that is correct and also frightening, and has decided that the correctness outweighs the frightening, and is now committed to living inside that decision until the end of it. She went back to the compound with Demuth and 3 ranchers from the auction, a man named Gus Haller, who had approximately the physical presence of a barn door and the calm demeanor of someone who had long since resolved his relationship with physical conflict, and 2 brothers, the Wace brothers, Abel and Tom, who'd had a boundary dispute with Briggs' company the previous spring that had cost them 40 acres and 3 months of legal fees for a case that was dismissed before it reached a proper hearing. The compound's main gate was open when they arrived, which told its own story. Open gates meant people had left, or were leaving, or had decided that the architecture of fortification no longer applied to their situation. There were 7 men in the bunkhouse nearest the main gate. Elena stood in the doorway, not inside, not far enough outside to seem like she was keeping her distance, just in the frame of it, where she could see them and they could see her. And she talked to them for 20 minutes. She told them what she'd found in Briggs' correspondence. She told them about Holloway and the federal investigation. She told them, specifically and without melodrama, what the legal exposure looked like for men who'd served as enforcement for a documented land fraud operation across multiple territories, and what cooperation with a federal investigation typically produced in terms of that exposure. 2 men left during the conversation, walked out past her without making eye contact, and saddled their horses and rode north. She didn't try to stop them. The ones who left were the ones who'd calculated fastest, which meant they'd also calculated that leaving was the better option, which meant they'd accepted the premise of what she'd told them. The remaining 5 sat with it. "What does cooperation look like?" one of them asked. He was maybe 40, with a scar along his jaw and the tired eyes of someone who'd been tired for a long time. "Practically. It means giving a federal officer a truthful account of what you witnessed and what you participated in," she said. "It means not destroying documents or removing property from this building. It means being findable when Holloway's people come, which will be within the week." She paused. "It doesn't mean you walk away clean. I'm not in a position to promise that, and I won't. But there's a considerable difference between cooperating and not cooperating, and you're in a position to choose which one you are." The man with the scar looked at the floor, then at his hands, then at her. "Curry's going to come back." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe Corey's going to look at the situation clearly and make the same calculation you're making right now." She didn't know if this was true. She thought it was possible. Either way, what Corey does isn't your decision. What you do is. Another man left, then another. The 3 who remained said, in different words and with varying degrees of resignation, that they'd stay and cooperate. She believed 2 of them. The third she wasn't sure about, but 2 out of 3 was better than none. Gus Haller found the storage cellar. It was behind the office house, underneath a section of floor that had a trapdoor concealed by a workbench that was too heavy to move without knowing it moved. DeMuth had known it existed, but not where, and it was Haller who found it, methodically, by walking the floor of the office house and listening to how it sounded under his boots until he found the section that sounded different. There were 4 people inside. Elena went down the ladder first, which was not comfortable in the low dark, and she stood at the bottom and let her eyes adjust and looked at what she'd found. 3 men and 1 woman. The men were in poor shape, thin, unshaven, the particular stillness of people who've been in a confined space long enough that they've stopped fighting the confinement and simply exist inside it. The woman was in better physical condition, but her eyes had the flat, braced quality of someone who'd stopped expecting anything good. "It's over," Elena said. "Briggs gone. You're coming out of here." Nobody moved immediately, which she understood. Words are easy. Promises in a cellar from a stranger are hard to believe. "My name is Elena Cross," she said. "Thomas Cross's daughter. I know most of you have heard of my father, even if you didn't know me. I'm telling you it's over, and I need you to believe me enough to come up the ladder." The woman moved first. Her name, she said when she reached the top of the ladder and stood blinking in the office house's ordinary light, was Ruth Pardo. She'd been down there 11 days. Her husband had disputed a land claim against Briggs' company, and Briggs' men had taken her as leverage while the dispute resolved itself, which it had, in Briggs' favor, because what choice does a man have when they have his wife in a cellar? Elena stood next to Ruth Pardo while she breathed real air and looked at the sky through the office house window, and she didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would be adequate to 11 days in a cellar. She just stayed there, present, which was the minimum decency the situation required. The 3 men were a former county land clerk who'd refused to file a fraudulent document and found himself in the cellar rather than his office the following morning. A rancher from the North Range who'd organized other ranchers to collectively challenge Briggs' debt instruments and had been removed from the situation before the challenge could consolidate. And an older man who hadn't spoken yet and didn't appear to be ready to. She left DeMuth to manage the logistics of getting them food and water and whatever medical attention could be organized from Teller's Ridge, and she went to the office house and did something she hadn't had time to do during her earlier visit. She went through it properly. Prentice Evers was gone. Had left with Brigg, or before, she couldn't tell. But his work was still there. Evers was the kind of organized that borders on compulsive, and his files were labeled and indexed and arranged with the neat precision of a man who took pride in systems. Elena pulled the files that were labeled with county names, all 4 counties Brigg had operated in, and stacked them on the work table and worked through them systematically for 2 hours, while the afternoon went dark outside, and DeMuth lit a lamp and brought it to her without being asked. What was in those files was the full architecture of it. Not just land fraud, that was the surface. Underneath was a coordinated effort to control the development of territory that would, within the next 5 years, become a proper state with proper governance, and to control it in ways that would shape how that governance looked and who it served, and what it permitted. The names in those files included county officials, territorial legislators, a federal land assessor who'd been receiving quarterly payments, and 3 judges. Not 2. 3. The third being the circuit judge Elena had believed to be legitimate, who turned out to have been bought more cleverly and more recently than the others. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt, sitting with those files in the lamplit office house of a man who'd built his operation in the space between law and its enforcement, something more like the weight of a thing you've been carrying for a long time finally touching the ground. Her father's face. Thomas Cross, quiet and steady, reading his delayed newspapers on the porch, planting cottonwoods for shade he wouldn't live to sit in. He had not deserved what happened to him. He had simply been in the way of something large and patient and well-funded, and being in the way is sometimes all it takes. She wrapped the files in the oilcloth she found in Evers' supply drawer, and tied them and put them next to the door for transport. Then she sat down, for the first time in what felt like several days, and did nothing for a few minutes. Just sat, with the lamp burning on the work table, and the night sounds coming through the window, and the distant voices of Demuth and Holler organizing things in the yard. Just let herself be tired, which she'd been not letting herself be, because tired was a thing you couldn't afford in the middle of something. Quotes. Ronan came back at 11 o'clock that night, and she heard the gray horse in the yard and went to the office house door and looked out. And she could tell from the way he was sitting the saddle, more carefully than usual, the slight overcorrection of a man managing something, that something had gone wrong, or sideways, or both. He dismounted slowly. She crossed the yard. He got to the telegraph office, she said. It wasn't quite a question. 40 minutes ahead of me. He handed the gray's reins to Demuth's boy, who'd reappeared from somewhere, and stood still for a moment as if getting his bearings. His left hand was wrapped in his bandana, tied off at the wrist, with a dark stain that had dried to brown. Curry was with him. He's better with a gun than I'd accounted for. Let me see your hand. It's not... Let me see it. He held it out without further argument, which told her it was worse than he wanted to characterize. She unwrapped the bandana and looked at it in the yard's lamplight. A cut across the back of his hand, deep, from something edged rather than a bullet. A knife, probably. It had bled heavily and stopped, which was good, but it needed cleaning and closing or it would go the way of Jared's arm at Barrel Creek. Inside, she said. She cleaned and dressed it at Evers' work table with the medical supplies she'd found in a cabinet while going through the office house. Evers had kept a well-stocked first aid kit, which said something about the kind of operation he'd been running and the kinds of things that happened in it. Ronan sat without complaint while she worked, which was not the same as sitting without noticing. She could feel the tension in his hand, the control he was maintaining over it. Briggs sent a message, he said. I got there in time to read the copy the telegraph operator was required to keep. It went to the financial backer. The name on your summary. He waited while she tied off the bandage. He told them the federal investigation was further along than they knew, and that he needed immediate extraction and legal support. And Corey? Corey is gone. He made a decision at the telegraph office when I showed up. Looked at me, looked at the situation, and rode west. Not with Brigg, his own direction. He's cutting loose. Yes. Ronan flexed his bandaged hand carefully. Curry's not stupid. He'll have money saved and a place he can go. He's been in this work long enough to know when a situation is finished. And Brigg? Ronan looked at her. I detained him. You... She stopped. How? He'd gone to the telegraph office alone, sent Corey ahead to manage horses and supplies at the far end of the depot. When I arrived, it was just him and the telegraph operator. He paused. The operator was glad to see me. Where's he now? I left him with 2 men from the depot who were willing to sit on him until Holloway's people arrive. I sent a second telegram to Prescott from the depot. He looked at his hand. Holloway will be here by Wednesday. Maybe sooner if he pushes. Wednesday was 3 days. Elena thought about the files wrapped in oilcloth, about Ruth Pardo breathing real air through an office house window, about the paper moving through ranchers' hands at the auction. 3 days was a long time, and also not very long at all, measured against what it had taken to get here. The files are ready, she said. The prisoners are out. Demuth is organizing food and transport for anyone who needs to get somewhere. She looked at him across the work table. What you said at the auction today about the debt against my father's land, the notary's expired commission, how did you know that specific detail? Holloway's office pulled the notary's registration records 2 months ago as part of the investigation. He met her eyes. That's when I knew the case was solid enough to move on. You could have moved sooner. I needed more evidence to ensure federal action. Without the financial connection, the backing, Brigg could have cut losses and moved to another territory. I needed everything in place before I pushed him. He said it the way he said most things, factually, without defensiveness, but not without awareness that the answer was complicated. Your father's land was part of the evidence I was building toward. I know that's... I'm not blaming you, she said. It was true, and also not simple. Both things could be true. I understand the logic. I might have done the same. She paused. I might not have. No, he said quietly. You probably wouldn't have. They sat with that for a moment in the lamp's steady light. The former county land clerk, whose name turned out to be Harold Gaines, and who'd been in the cellar for 22 days, which was the longest of any of them, appeared in the doorway of the office house, with a tin mug in each hand. He was thin and moving carefully, still finding his legs, but he had the deliberate focus of a man who'd made a decision about how to re-enter the world, and was acting on it one small action at a time. Coffee, he said. Demuth made it. It's decent. He set the mugs on the work table and looked at the stacked oilcloth files. Something moved through his face, recognition, and then something older and harder and more relieved. Those are Evers' records. Yes, Elena said. I spent 2 weeks trying to copy those records before they caught me. He looked at her. You got them. We got them, she said. Gaines looked at Ronan, then back at her. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something else and then deciding against it, or deciding it didn't need to be said, which was its own way of saying it. He nodded once, precisely, and went back into the yard. The next 3 days were not triumphant. That was the thing about the aftermath of something. It looked like resolution from a distance and looked like work from inside it. The work was finding people and getting to them and explaining what had happened and what it meant for their land and their families and their futures, and doing it settlement by settlement, ranch by ranch, because information that changes someone's life needs to be delivered by a person and not a notice board. Elena and Ronan split the territory between them. She took the North Range, which she knew better, riding from ranch to ranch with Gaines beside her because Gaines knew the names and faces and histories of the land cases better than anyone. He'd been the one filing the paperwork, had seen what was done to it, could speak to each family about their specific situation in the specific language of their specific injustice. He was still thin, still moving with the care of someone whose body was catching up with events, but he was sharper than anyone she'd met in recent memory. His mind a careful filing system of dates and parcel numbers and procedural details that were, it turned out, exactly what people needed to hear when they were trying to understand what had happened to them. The reactions were not uniform. Some families cried. Some got very still and very quiet in the way of people who've been processing grief for a long time and don't have an easy outlet for the end of it. One woman, whose family's cattle ranch had been absorbed by Briggs' company the previous winter, sat at her kitchen table and didn't say anything for 3 full minutes, and then said, very precisely, "What do I need to do?" Not a question, a request for instructions. Elena gave her specific ones, the name and contact at Holloway's office, what documentation to bring, what to expect from the process, and how long it would take, and what it would and wouldn't be able to give back. What it wouldn't give back was time. Elena said that honestly to everyone because it was true and because people needed to hear it from someone who wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The land could be returned, the records corrected, the financial damages at least partially addressed through the federal process, but the year or 2 years or 3 years of uncertainty and fear and disrupted life, that didn't have a remedy. It had only the fact of it being over, which was not the same as healing, but was the necessary ground for it. Pete Dunbar, who'd stood in the market square in Dry Hollow and not met her eyes while she stood on the platform, came to find her on the 3rd day at a ranch she was visiting north of town. He arrived on his horse and tied it to the post and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. That same helpless gesture as the younger Sutter boy at Barrel Creek, she thought. The hat as an emblem of not knowing what to do with yourself in a moment that required something more than you had available. "Miss Cross," he said. She stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked at him. She didn't say anything yet. "I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "At the auction, I should have—" Another stop. He turned his hat in his hands. "I've known your family for 12 years. "I know," she said. "That doesn't—" He seemed to be fighting with something. "There's no way to say what I should have done that doesn't make me sound like I'm asking for absolution, and I'm not asking for that. I just needed to say it." She thought about what she could say to him, and about what would be true and what would be kind, and whether those were the same thing here. She thought about her father, who had been a man of considerable decency and patience, and about what he would have said. "People are afraid," she said finally. "Real fear isn't like it looks in stories. It doesn't make you a coward for being afraid. It makes you human." She paused. "What you do on the other side of being afraid, that's the part that matters." Pete Dunbar stood in the yard and looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he hasn't earned and knows it, and she watched him decide to accept it anyway, which was its own kind of courage. The lesser, but still real courage of accepting grace when you don't deserve it and choosing to do something different with it going forward. "Is there something I can do, what?" he said. "For what's happening now?" "Yes," she said. "Gaines is writing to the Alderton families next week. The people whose cases were filed through the county clerk before Gaines was taken. He needs someone who knows the North Range roads and can make sure he gets where he's going safely." She looked at him. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "Yes, I can do that." Holloway arrived on Wednesday, as Ronan had estimated, with 2 deputy officers and a legal secretary who'd been traveling through the night for 2 days. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with the manner of someone who had been doing meticulous work for a long time and was not particularly interested in dramatic acknowledgement of it. He shook Ronan's hand and then Elena's, and looked at the wrapped oilcloth files with an expression that was, just briefly, the expression of a man who'd been waiting for something very specific for a very long time. "These are Evers's records?" he said. "Yes," Elena said. "And a summary I wrote of additional correspondence from Briggs' desk. I left the originals in place for you." Holloway looked at the summary, her handwriting fast and compressed, covering both sides of the paper. He read it once, fully, and then read 3 sections again. "The financial account reference," he said. "This figure, this is from a specific letter?" "Dated 14 months ago, upper right drawer of Briggs' desk, in a leather portfolio tied with cord." "You saw this personally." "I read it personally, in that room, and summarized it in that room. It's my handwriting on paper I brought. The letter itself is still where I found it." Holloway looked at her for a moment with the evaluative look of a man assessing the reliability of a witness. "Your memory for figures is accurate?" "Yes," she said simply. He nodded once and went back to the files. He spent the next 4 hours in the office house with his secretary, working through everything with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that this moment was only valuable if it was built correctly, that the whole construction could come apart if the legal foundation wasn't exact, and that exact was the only standard worth applying. Elena left him to it. She went outside and found Ronan at the water trough, watering the gray, doing the ordinary patient work of taking care of an animal that had carried him a long way. "He'll do it right," Ronan said, without looking up from what he was doing. "I know. It'll take time. The courts, the restitution process, the official record corrections. Months, maybe a year." "I know that too." He looked up at her then. "Are you going to stay?" She'd been thinking about this. Had been thinking about it since the storage cellar, since Ruth Pardo breathing real air, since Harold Gaines appearing in the office house doorway with 2 mugs of coffee and that precise, grateful nod. "Yes," she said. "There's work here that needs to be done, and I know how to do it. The families who've lost land need someone to help them navigate the restitution process, someone who understands both the legal side and their specific situations." She looked at him. "And my father's land is here, the cottonwoods along the creek boundary. I'm not leaving that. He nodded, slowly, taking that in. The gray drank, and the water made its ordinary sound. What about you? She said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his horse. The bandaged hand rested on the animal's neck. Holloway's going to need field work done while the case proceeds. Following up on the connections to the backer, the legislative contacts, the assessor. He paused. It'll keep me in the territory. She looked at him. He looked at her. Nothing dramatic passed between them. They were both too tired for dramatic, and too practical, and too honest about what they were and what the territory was and what it required. But something was there. Something that had been building across canyons and blizzards and locked drawers and terrible coffee in a dead-end settlement, across the particular intimacy of two people managing a dangerous situation together and coming out the other side of it without having broken. Good, she said. Yeah, he said. They stood by the water trough in the late afternoon, and Holloway worked in the office house with his files, and somewhere north of them, Harold Gaines was eating a proper meal for the first time in 22 days, and Ruth Pardo had a roof and a window and air she could breathe freely, and Pete Dunbar was riding back to his ranch to prepare for a trip to the Alderton families next week, and the gray horse drank its fill. None of it was finished. None of it was clean. But it was real, and it was moving in the right direction, and sometimes that was everything. The cottonwoods along the creek boundary were still there. Elena had half expected them not to be, had braced for it on the ride back to the Cross property for the first time since the morning Briggs' men came to the door, prepared herself for the possibility that Brigg had cleared the land or altered it in some deliberate act of erasure. But they were there. 12 trees her father had planted when she was 7 years old, grown now into genuine shade-givers, their leaves catching the October light and turning it into something that moved. She sat on the roan at the fence line and looked at them for a long time without getting down. Just looked, the way you look at something you weren't sure you'd see again. Then she got down, tied the horse, and went to work. The house needed cleaning. The barn needed assessment. The well needed testing before she trusted it. These were practical problems with practical solutions, and she addressed them in order because that was what the situation called for, and because staying in motion was, at this point, the most honest way she knew to process everything that had happened. Grief and relief and anger, and something that wasn't quite either of those things. They were all present, but they were also manageable if you kept them company instead of letting them crowd you into a corner. Holloway's process had moved with the methodical speed of federal machinery operated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Silas Brigg had been formally arrested and transported to the territorial capital within a week of Holloway's arrival. Prentice Evers had been located 3 days later in a boarding house in a town 2 territories east, where he'd apparently been working under a different name on what was either a new version of the same scheme or the continuation of an existing one. Holloway's people hadn't been fully clear on that point, and Elena suspected the full picture was more complicated than anyone had yet untangled. The financial backer, whose name was Vane, Arthur Vane, a land investment principal based in a city that had no reason to intersect with the frontier except that it wanted to own what the frontier would become, had retained lawyers immediately and was fighting the federal charges from a position of considerable resource and considerable distance. He would probably not go to prison. Elena had come to accept this, not without bitterness, but with the particular realism of someone who understood that systems of justice are built by people, and therefore reflect the priorities and limitations of people, which includes the priority of protecting wealth and the limitation of caring more about what's difficult to prosecute than what's wrong. Vane would pay fines. He would divest from certain investments under legal pressure. The evidence she'd copied at Briggs' desk, combined with Holloway's 8 months of case building and Evers's eventual cooperation, Evers had cooperated thoroughly in exchange for a reduced charge, would cost Vane enough that his operation in this territory was finished. Whether he rebuilt it elsewhere was a question for other people in other places. Brigg himself would stand trial. Gaines had testified. Ruth Pardo had testified. The 3 ranchers from the storage cellar had testified. Elena had given her account to Holloway in a 6-hour session at a table in Dry Hollow's newly reorganized county office, going through everything she'd seen and heard and copied and remembered, and Holloway had listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that a good witness is worth more than almost any other kind of evidence, and that a good witness is made by precision and honesty rather than emotion. "You'll be called to testify at the trial," Holloway had told her when they were done. "I know," she said. "It won't be comfortable." "Most things worth doing aren't," she said. And he'd looked at her with a small expression that might have been the federal officer version of agreement. The 2 county judges on Briggs' payroll had resigned before charges could be formally filed against them, which was its own kind of outcome. Not satisfying exactly, but functional. The circuit judge, the third one, the one Elena had believed legitimate and wasn't, had been suspended pending investigation. His replacement on the circuit was a woman from the eastern part of the territory, which surprised people who hadn't been paying attention and surprised nobody who had. The land restitution process was slower. It was always going to be slower because land is specific in a way that money isn't. You can't simply reverse a transaction and restore what was, because time has passed and things have changed, and the law has to account for that without letting the accounting become a way of perpetuating the wrong. Elena worked with Gaines on this, the 2 of them moving through the case files with the systematic patience of people who understood that this was the actual work. The work that wasn't dramatic but mattered more than most of the dramatic things. 14 families recovered their full land within the first 4 months. 7 more recovered partial acreage with financial compensation for the remainder. 3 cases were still in process when winter came. She held monthly meetings at the Cross Ranch, in the barn, because it was large enough, with her father's old chairs and tables supplemented by whatever people brought themselves. They came from all over the North Range, and from Dry Hollow proper, and from as far as Teller's Ridge, and they talked about the legal process and the restitution timeline and the practical questions of how to rebuild what had been damaged. And they argued, sometimes sharply, because people who've been through something hard together don't always agree on what to do next. And Elena had learned that argument is not the opposite of community. It's part of it. The part that proves people are actually invested rather than just going along. Ruth Pardo came to every meeting. She'd become, almost without anyone deciding it, the person who kept track of which families needed what and who in the community could provide it. Not a formal position, just a function she'd assumed because she was organized and because 11 days in a cellar had apparently clarified for her what she wanted to spend her time on. Her husband had gotten his land back. He was not the same man he'd been before the dispute, and she was not the same woman, and their marriage was working through what that meant in the private way that marriages do. But they were working through it, which was the part that mattered. Pete Dunbar rode with Gaines to the Alderton families as he'd promised, and came back 2 weeks later a different kind of quiet than he'd been before. He never spoke directly about what had happened at the auction, about the not meeting her eyes. But he showed up at every monthly meeting, and he sat near the front, and he was always the first to volunteer for whatever the next practical task was. Elena understood this as the only apology that actually means anything. Not the words of it, but the changed behavior, the consistent choosing differently. She accepted it as such, which didn't mean forgetting it, just filing it in the right category. Arnie Foss sent the flour tin from Cutler's Crossing. It arrived wrapped in burlap, the letter inside still intact, the photograph of her father on top where she'd placed it. She put the photograph on the mantelpiece of the Cross Ranch house, in the corner where the light hit it in the afternoon, and she did not look at it every day, but she knew it was there, which was enough. Well, Ronan was in and out of the territory through the fall and winter, following the threads of Holloway's investigation into the connections beyond Brigg, Vane's network, the legislative contacts, the federal assessor who'd eventually been charged and had begun cooperating in a way that kept opening new doors into how the scheme had actually operated. The work kept him moving, which was, Elena understood, both its practical requirement and also simply who he was. He was not a man built for staying still, which she'd known from the first day and which she'd never tried to change, because trying to change that would have been trying to change the thing that made him useful and real. He came through Dry Hollow in November with his collar up against the cold and a new scar on his jaw that she didn't ask about yet because it had the look of something recent and still being processed. She fed him at the Cross Ranch table, the first meal cooked in that kitchen in over a year, a fact she didn't comment on because it would have made it heavy when she wanted it to be ordinary, And they talked about the investigation and the trial timeline and the practical mechanics of the federal case. And then they talked about other things, smaller things, the way people talk when they've moved past the urgency of the situation that brought them together and are finding out what's on the other side of it. Gaines thinks the last 3 land cases will close by spring, she said. Good. He's going to stay. He's talking about opening a proper legal practice here, land law specifically. Ronan turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a habit she'd noticed, something to do while thinking. He's good enough for it. He's meticulous, and he understands what these families have been through. She looked at him across the table. The scar. He touched his jaw briefly. Corey. She'd known somehow that it would be Corey. You found him. He found me, closer to accurate. He'd been tracking the investigation's field movements and decided to remove a variable. A pause. He's in federal custody now. That part's done. She nodded. She felt the weight of it, of everything that word done was trying to carry, and she let it settle without pushing it. The Sutter boys. The 2 from Barrel Creek. I got a letter last week. Their father recovered. They're back on the ranch. Good, he said, and this time the word had a different quality, something warmer in it. The older one enclosed a note. He said to tell you he wrote down everything that happened, just like I told him to. Gave it to Holloway's office. She looked at her coffee. He said it was the most useful thing he'd ever done with a piece of paper. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the evening light was doing something complicated with the clouds over the western ridge, going orange and deep red before it quit for the night. Your father would have been glad to see this house lit up again, he said. It was simply said, without performance of sentiment, which was why it landed the way it did. She took a breath and let it out. Yes, she said, he would have. They sat in the ordinary quiet of the kitchen, and it was the kind of quiet that has people in it rather than the kind that's made of absence, and that distinction was everything. Bishop. The trial of Silas Brigg opened in the territorial capital in February and lasted 11 days. Elena testified on the 4th day. She sat in the witness chair in a courtroom that was larger and more formal than anything in Dry Hollow, but still essentially frontier in its bones. The wood rough, the heating inconsistent, the faces in the gallery weathered by years of outdoor work. And she answered the questions she was asked with the precision she'd been giving to everything for the past 8 months. Brigg's lawyers were good. She'd known they would be. They tried the usual approaches, challenging her memory, questioning her motives, framing her actions at the compound as trespassing and theft rather than the recovery of documented evidence of systematic fraud. She answered everything directly. She did not get flustered, which seemed to frustrate the lead attorney, who'd apparently expected her to. She noticed Brigg watching her from the defendant's table with those flat coin eyes, and she looked back at him without looking away, because she'd been looking at the shape of what he'd built for long enough that the man himself no longer frightened her. On the 8th day, Gaines testified about the land clerk records. On the 9th, Holloway presented the full body of documentary evidence. On the 11th day, the jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict on all 7 counts. She was standing in the corridor outside the courtroom when she heard it. Not the specific words, which she couldn't make out through the door, but the change in the room's sound that told her the verdict had been read. She stood against the corridor wall with her hands at her sides, and she waited. And Gaines came out first, and the look on his face was the answer before he said a word. Guilty, he said. All 7. She nodded. She thought she'd feel more in that moment, had expected something bigger, some climactic shift in the emotional landscape. What she actually felt was quieter than that, something that was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight than to triumph. She'd been carrying the fact of what happened to her father, and to the families of the North Range, and to Ruth Pardo in a cellar, and to Harold Gaines and the rancher, and the older man who still didn't talk much for long enough that the end of the formal process felt less like victory and more like the first morning in a long time when she woke up and the first thought wasn't about the case. She went outside into the February cold and stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the cold air, and Ronan was there, leaning against the hitching post with his hat pulled down and his arms folded, and he looked at her when she came out. Guilty, she said. Yeah, he said. I heard the room. She came down the steps and stood next to him, not dramatically, just stood there in the cold, and they looked at the territorial capital's main street, which was ordinary and busy and full of people who didn't know what had just happened in the building behind them and were going about their Tuesday in the specific way of people for whom this Tuesday was simply a Tuesday. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "That there are places where Brig operated before Dry Hollow where none of this happened, where the families lost their land and there was no Halloway and no investigation and no one who stayed and organized the meetings and pushed the restitution process." She wasn't saying it for comfort or for a particular response. She was saying it because it was true and because she'd been thinking it for months, the awareness that what had happened in Dry Hollow was not inevitable, was contingent on specific people making specific choices under specific pressure, and that the absence of any one of those people or choices would have produced a different outcome. There are families in other territories still carrying what those families carried. "Yes," Ronan said, "there are." "That doesn't end with Brig." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She looked at him. He looked back, steady as always, and she thought about what she knew of him now after 8 months. His precision and his patience, and the way he'd said, "our problem," instead of just yours in a mining shack in a blizzard, and the way he'd handed the Sutter boy an address on a scrap of paper margin without asking anything in return, and the particular quality of his attention, which was never performed and never absent. He was not a simple man, and she was not a simple woman, and what was between them was not simple either, but it was real, which was the only standard she'd ever held anything to. "Halloway's got another case," Ronan said. 2 territories west. Different operation, same shape. He's asked if I'd do the field work." "Are you going?" "Probably." He looked at her. "It's the same pattern, Elena. Different names, same mechanism. Manufactured debt, purchased judges, consolidated land before territorial governance gets established. Someone needs to be in the field before the documentation is gone." She thought about her father's cottonwoods and the kitchen with the light on and the monthly meetings in the barn and the 14 families with their land back and the 3 still working toward it. She thought about what it meant to stay and what it meant to go, and whether those were as different as they sounded, or whether they were just 2 versions of the same commitment to the same work in different places. "Write to me," she said. "When you can." "I will." "And if Halloway's case puts you near the Sutter boys' territory?" "I'll check on them." She nodded. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. Some things don't need to be larger than they are to be genuine, and she'd learned over the past 8 months that the frontier had a way of stripping language down to what it actually meant, that words spoken simply and meant fully were worth more than elaborate declarations that were mostly performing the thing rather than being it. They stood on the courthouse steps in the February cold until the cold got practical about it, and then they went and had a meal at the nearest establishment that was serving, which wasn't much but was hot. And they talked about the trip back to Dry Hollow and the 3 remaining land cases, and whether Gaines was actually going to open a legal practice or was still in the thinking about it phase, and it was an ordinary conversation between 2 people who had been through something extraordinary and had come out the other side into the ordinary, which is where life actually happens. What Elena Cross understood on the ride back through the February landscape toward Dry Hollow and the Cross Ranch and the cottonwoods along the creek boundary was something that she hadn't had the language for when she was standing on that auction platform with her wrists bound and the town watching and nobody meeting her eyes. She understood it now not as a lesson learned, but as a thing lived. That justice is not a destination. It is work. It is specific, unglamorous, repetitive work done by specific people who decide over and over in small moments, rather than one large dramatic one, that the doing of it is worth what it costs. The people who built things worth having in this territory, the families who dug their wells and planted their boundary trees and raised their children in the particular difficult beauty of the frontier, they hadn't done it because it was easy or because they were exceptional. They'd done it because they stayed, because they kept showing up to the ordinary work, even when the ordinary work was actually very hard, and because they found other people who were also showing up, and because accumulated presence is, in the end, the only thing that builds anything that lasts. Her father had known this, had planted trees for shade he wouldn't sit in, had kept his accounts in meticulous order, and his word without exception, and his door open to neighbors who needed coffee and a place to sit. He had been a man of ordinary quiet virtue in a territory that was not always kind to such men, and Silas Brigg had come along and used that virtue against him, and the world had not corrected that automatically, had not balanced the scales out of any innate moral architecture. People had corrected it, specific people making specific choices. That was the thing worth carrying forward. Not the story of the auction or the manhunt or the locked drawer or the trial. Those were events, and events end. What didn't end was the fact that a community of people had looked at what had been done to them and decided one by one and together that the next thing they built would be built differently, would be built with attention to who was being left out and who was holding too much power and what documents were being signed by whom and whether the people doing the signing actually had the authority they claimed. Nobody could promise them it would last. The frontier had no such promises to make. But they were making it anyway, out of the material of what they had. Imperfect people with imperfect tools and a clear enough understanding of what they were working against that they could keep working even when the progress was slow and the setbacks were real and the justice was incomplete. The roan moved steadily through the winter landscape, and Elena rode her the way she'd ridden her across canyons and through blizzards and into a compound full of armed men, without drama, with attention, adjusting to what the ground required. In her coat pocket was a letter she hadn't opened yet, arrived yesterday from Dorothea Wills in Oran's Pass, and she'd been saving it for the ride home because Dorothea's letters were always worth reading somewhere you could look up from them and see the sky. She opened it now, with the February light coming flat and clean across the landscape, and Dorothea's precise handwriting said, "My brother's case was settled last week in his favor, full acreage restored. He asked me to pass along that he wishes he knew who to thank. I told him the answer was complicated. He said most good answers are. I think he's right." Elena folded the letter and put it back in her pocket and rode home. The cottonwoods were there when she arrived. They always would be for a while yet. Decades of shade for people she'd never meet, doing the quiet, long work of simply standing in their place and being what they were. Her father had understood something about that. She was beginning to. She unsaddled the roan, gave her water and feed, and went inside to light the lamp.